Welcome to Homiletics Masters. What we're going to talk about in this lesson are moves, right? And I'll kind of explain what I mean by that. We've talked about some of the components, some of the tools you'll use with words and stories. And in this lesson, I want to kind of shift from kind of the components to maybe more of a look at the structure, right? Of how are we going to begin to fit these things in so that they flow together nicely, right? And so one of the ways of looking at it is combining your different thoughts into more of a series of moves. How are we going to move the sermon idea that we have in the beginning through its progression to where we naturally want to end up? One of the textbooks for this class by Andy Stanley, and hopefully you've read it by now, but it's the kind of deals with the idea of having kind of one main thought. And I do think that's important, although it's good to understand, and he makes this clear that it may be one thought you want them to leave with, but you're going to approach that from a variety of different ways. So you're going to have a whole bunch of different thoughts and ideas and illustrations and things you work in. But it is good to have a clear idea of what you're trying to communicate. And sometimes we try and communicate too much. You know, we look at a text and we come up with 8 different points out of that text. It can be a challenge. I tend to disagree a little bit from the book, and let me explain why and in what way. They kind of make it seem as though, and this is not just this textbook, I want to make that clear too, that you will get this a lot in homiletics preaching, that because at the end of a sermon, they may not be able to remember what all you said, right? I mean, that's something that you'll hear in a lot of homiletics books, that, the spoken word, by the time they hear it and they're walking out the door, they've forgot most of it, and then 3 months later they can't tell you anything about the sermon. And so the idea is if you have one solid point, they can walk out of there remembering it. And there is some truth to that. But I would also challenge that, let me put it this way. When you do your morning devotions, right, and hopefully you have a core set of morning devotions, week by week, month by month, you read and you read and you read, and you begin to notice that you are maturing and growing in your understanding of the Lord, and that your wisdom has increased. And you may not be able, if you picked up some of the books that you read, you may not be able to remember most of what you read in that book. But the process of retaining it and being exposed to it changes you over time. I believe that there are parts of your spirit and your brain that retain things that you may not necessarily be able to recall the specific wording and the specific points, but just being around it begins to change you, right? So I guess I'm throwing that out there at the beginning as just kind of a reference that just because someone in your congregation can't remember the points that you made specifically doesn't mean that they weren't influenced by the sermon, right? And that the sermon didn't take root in their spirit and in their mind, because a lot of times we have a hard time remembering specific points. I have a hard time remembering somebody's name sometimes if you ask me right off on the spot and I wasn't thinking about it. Sometimes, we've all had that where somebody asks you something and you're like, man, I know it, I just can't remember it. And so, to a certain degree, you experience that, I believe, in sermons, that just because the people can't quickly remember exactly what your 3 points were from 3 months ago doesn't mean that sitting under that style of preaching doesn't have a cumulative effect over time. So I think in some ways that just because they don't walk out remembering exactly what your points are does not necessarily mean that they were not influenced and changed by your sermon. And so I see a lot of teaching today on homiletics and preaching that says, oh, well, if they can't remember your sermon when they leave, that it didn't affect them. But I don't think that's true. There's a lot of books over the years that I've read, and they have influenced me. But if you were to ask me exactly what the points were out of those books, I may not be able to tell you, but the cumulative effect of them has made a major influence in my life, even if I can't, off the top of my head, remember the chapter headings of the book, right? Which would be the equivalent of the points in your sermon. And so as we're thinking about this, I think there are some good points out of the Andy Stanley book. I mean, that's why I wanted you to read it. I think there are some good things. I think the emphasis of having one point is important, that you want to have a clear direction of where you're taking them. But I would kind of challenge a little bit that idea that just because they can't remember your main points means that they're not being influenced by your sermon. So you got to give them one point that they're going to remember, and then that means they were influenced. That's not necessarily true. There's a lot of good sermons that have had multiple points. That's true. They can't necessarily quote your points back, right? But that doesn't mean that there was not change and that there wasn't growth. Anyways, that's something to remember. And so as we're thinking about putting together these points, however many of them you have, I would offer up another kind of thought about how to think about this, is not so much just in points. I think sometimes that it feels rigid. And it doesn't mean that you can't ever preach a sermon where there's a couple of points and you say point 1 and point 2. But I would say that for the most part, that feels very rigid when you do that. It doesn't lend itself to flowing very well. That stop and start, I think that is one of the bigger areas, other than having just, the Andy Stanley book makes out the point that if you have more than one main point, it's hard for people to remember it. I would also argue that you could have more than one point and people can remember it if the points flow together logically, right? Where it becomes a challenge for people is when point 1 does not logically connect well with point number 2, and you're launching out into a totally different subject area. I've preached sermons with 2 or 3 points that ultimately, like Andy Stanley's book is saying, are flowing towards one main idea, right? And so it's in that logical progression of ideas, right? We're an American, many of the people you preach to are American congregations, and the things that we are used to watching, the American way of telling stories is often very linear. You begin at the beginning and you end at the end, right? If you study Hebrew literature, it's not always that way. They bounce around a little bit. They may talk to you about something. I was reading stuff from the life of Saul today, and there's certain points when Saul is being anointed by Samuel where it jumps back and forth. It tells you the point of view from Saul, and then it goes back after that and tells you some things that happened before in the life of Samuel. So it's not beginning to end. It's kind of bouncing around, right? It tells you everything that happened with Saul, and then it kind of tells you then what happened 3 days earlier with Samuel to kind of make sense. That was a very Hebrew way of telling the stories, that they didn't necessarily go beginning to end, which sometimes throws off our translators and things and our people writing commentaries, and they say, oh, well, look at this. Obviously, this must have been thrown in at a later date. It's not in chronological order. I get that. You read that a lot in commentaries that are trying to nitpick the Bible and trying to figure out all these things that could be wrong, and they call it source criticism, where they try and figure out all the different contributors to a book, and they try and say, well, there must have been all the 10 different people that wrote this book over the years, and it's all kind of compiled together. Where's the source? Who was the one that wrote these things? But a lot of times that just belies a lack of understanding of Hebrew writing. That just because chapter 11 takes place before chapter 10 doesn't mean that somebody came in and wrote that later, that's often just the way that the Hebrew mind worked, that they were not linear. And that Eastern storytelling method is not necessarily linear like a Western one is. And so a lot of times, these commenters that read, through that, and they want to make assumptions about who wrote it based on that. They're missing the big picture, really. And so the way that influences homiletics is that many of the people that you're going to be speaking to do have the Western mindset. It begins in the beginning, it ends at the end, and we go linearly through, and we expect that this next point is going to build on the point here, and it's going to build on this, and that there is going to be a progression from where we start to where we finish, right? And so that works well with the Western mind. And so that's something to keep in mind in your communicating and in your presentations, that when you are preaching, that you want to have that nice flow, right? It works well with the Western mind, that what I'm going into now has a reason because I built up in the beginning, and now what I'm coming into now stands on the shoulders of what just happened there. So if you're reading a novel in most Western cultures, chapter 2 takes place after chapter 1. And there's a progression, and it helps you to understand it that way. And that's the way that many people in this Western culture will hear sermons well, right? So that's something to think about. And so all of that means that in the preparation and the structure for our sermons, that we need to think of it in terms of movement, right? Moving from one thought to a final thought, right? And really the key to your sermon, and one of the keys to being able to preach without notes, is to understand what movement you're trying to take place, right? If you can break your sermon down into a series of movements that are smaller, 3 to 5 minute increments, where I'm moving from this spot to this spot to this spot. You don't want to move too quickly, because then people don't have a chance to process what you're saying. So, you need to stay in a spot for about 3 to 5 minutes so they can keep up with you. One thing to think about in terms of public speaking is that the larger the group, typically, the kind of more deliberate you need to be, right? Think of it like a ship or boat, right? If you've got a small jet ski, its turning radius is very quick, right? You can turn a jet ski on a dime, right? But if you have a large cruise ship, right, that's holding thousands of people, it takes a lot more. It's more deliberate. It's a slower turn. You can still make the turn, but in order to make sure everybody's there, it's a slow turn, right? Whereas a jet ski only has one person, and it can turn quick. That is communication theory for public speaking, that if I'm talking to one individual and we're just having a conversation, your husband, your wife, and you can bounce between subjects very quickly. Oh, what'd you do today? Oh, yeah, and then after that, this happened. And now, don't forget, we got to go to the store. And you can bounce between different things very quickly when it's one person. That's how communication works. That's the jet ski. The one person on the jet ski, it can turn very quickly. The 1,000-person audience is the cruise ship, and you have to turn very slowly with that. And so, if you're speaking to a group of 1,000, you don't want to be bouncing to all these different points. You're going to lose a lot of people. And so when you're preparing your moves, right, you want to make sure that you're going slow enough and deliberate enough for the size audience that you have, right? If you've got a group of 10 people in a care group setting or a small business meeting, you can go a little faster than you can with 20,000 people in a stadium. When you're at 20,000 people and you're getting ready to shift points, you need to make it very deliberate. You need to make sure that your transition sentence, that your logic behind why we're moving from this point to this point is very deliberate. You may take 2 or 3 sentences to do it. You may take, a minute or two to make sure that everybody is clear that why we're shifting from this thought into this thought, right? So the larger the ship, the more slow and deliberate the turn has to be, right? And so when you're putting together your moves, as I said, you've got a few of them, and you want to sit on them, for a few minutes. You need to develop each of these moves, right? Essentially every move, every segment of your sermon, right, should have a beginning and an ending, and then somewhere in the middle the idea is developed. And so part of being a gifted communicator and communicating well is thinking through the development of your ideas, right? And if it logically makes sense, why I have to move from this thought to this thought to this thought, the roadmap, if you will, in Andy Stanley's book. If it makes a lot of sense to you, right? First of all, if it doesn't make sense to you, you're going to have a hard time communicating it to other people. And so it has to make sense to you that, okay, the reason I'm moving from this point to this point to this point is because of this. And you understand the connection between the different components of your sermon. It helps you to preach without notes, right? Because if you don't understand that, if you just have 5 points that are not very well connected, they're part of that general idea. Maybe a lot of times what happens is somebody has a text, and if you just go from verse 1 to verse 10 of that chapter, it may cover, 5 different things, right? And so that's their sermon, is those 5 different things. And it can be a challenge then to make those 5 different things come together in a logical kind of sequence. And so they don't even try. They just say, well, then point number 2 is found in verse 3, and it's this, right? And it's kind of that breakup. And when you do it that way, it can be more of a challenge sometimes, depending on the person, but it can be more of a challenge to preach without the notes. Some people are naturally lean towards preaching without notes, but for anyone, particularly if you don't naturally lean towards preaching without notes, then you really need to make sure that the components in your sermon make sense if you're going to start making that shift to preaching without notes, which is important to do, I think. I mean, everybody's got their own style, but I really think that if a person can, that preaching without notes allows you to be a little more natural, to be a little more yourself. It forces you in many ways to know your material a little better. Somebody that's preaching off of notes, they can always in the back of their mind say, well, it's on the paper. As long as I read it well, it's okay. And I think with time, preaching without notes builds on itself. It raises your comfort level of speaking in front of people. It raises your brain's capacity to come up with stories as needed, right? As you're communicating without notes, your brain naturally starts to think of certain stories because you get a certain comfort level. Just like when you're talking with somebody in a private conversation, you and a friend are talking, and then all of a sudden that reminds you of something you did last week, and you're like, oh man, that reminds me of this. And you're thinking on your feet, right? A lot of times, though, when we get in front of people for the first time, our nervousness and our anxiety keeps us from doing that. But the more you get comfortable with it, the more you're able to do that. And so you have to weigh in the balance. You're a communicator and make a decision. Do I want to take this sermon in a new direction based on this thing that just popped into my spirit while I'm talking, right? Sometimes you will and sometimes you won't. Sometimes, you feel like the direction that you have from your preparation is right, and you stick to it. And then sometimes you feel that prompting from the Holy Spirit that the story that you're thinking of now would be, for somebody. And so you deviate a little bit and then maybe move back in to your flow. But there's a certain comfort level that comes from being able to do that you don't necessarily have if you are strictly preaching from notes. It can be a little more. It's not impossible, but it's a little more of a challenge to then kind of think on your feet when you get into that routine of not thinking on your feet, right? Okay, so a few things I want to throw at you as far as moves are concerned, and the concept of formulating these moves, right? So you need to think of yourself as a producer in a movie or something, that there are different scenes that are all telling one story, right? And they need to flow together well, and they need to be interesting to a certain extent. They need to not all be exactly the same. There needs to be some variety, and there needs to be some skill in the presentation, right? And so those are kind of the general framework of thinking about how to prepare your sermon. That it is really a combination of a few different individual components that you are weaving together to tell a story, right? Okay, so a couple of things to keep in mind when you're working on stuff like this would be the broadening and narrowing of perspective, right? That as you're flowing through all with the basic idea to tell one kind of point, even if there are other kind of sub points, so your sermon, I do agree with that, should have one main emphasis, right? But I also believe that within that main emphasis, there could be several strong supporting points that you put a lot of focus on. And so, as you're putting together these things, one thing to keep in mind is that you control the focus, the broadening and narrowing of the focus. And so whenever you're trying to emphasize something, say if you've got 2 or 3 kind of sub-emphasis that you think support your overall main point, that for each of those sub-emphasis, you may focus in on a specific event, right? Or you could broaden, and that may be a story, right? Or a life application or a testimony. You're focusing in on a specific aspect of that. Or you could broaden back out maybe and go to another place in the Word where it lists that principle, right? And you use the Word to show that broad principle that applies to that whole area. And then you kind of move from more focused to broad, and then maybe back down to more focused again. And so the perspective that you use is completely up to you. And so as a storyteller, as the crafter of a sermon, you have the ability to draw your audience's attention to specific aspects of the story for a moment, particularly if you're preaching, say, through a narrative, right? One of the historical narratives or something in the Bible, that there may be times when you draw the focus back to the big picture of what's going on in the story, and then other scenes, other moves that you have are more focused on one detail, right? So maybe if you're preaching on the scarlet cord from Joshua, that maybe one broad scene, you're painting the picture of the people of Israel preparing to receive God's promise, right? And then the next scene, you zoom in on the scarlet cord and the plight of this prostitute, Rahab, right? And then you maybe zoom back out and look at all of the people of Jericho and how all of the people of Jericho, except for this one woman, are lost and they're doomed because they didn't have the level of faith that she had, or whatever your point is, right? And then maybe you zoom back in on Joshua and his preparation for leadership to lead them in. And then you zoom back out again to maybe the 3 tribes that already had their inheritance. And so now they're going to have to come in with everyone else, though, and help them. And then maybe you zoom in on the spies, or maybe you zoom all the way to the New Testament and how that the scarlet cord was not just about that cord, it was about Christ. And you zoom in on the sacrifice of Jesus. And so you have this constant broadening of scope and narrowing of scope to make your emphasis, right? So as you're thinking together with your moves and how you're putting them together, you may think about what is my perspective here, right? What is my focus? Am I just narrowing in on one specific thing? Or am I painting a broad picture? The detail words and the descriptions that you use are how you paint that, right? That if it's about a big broad picture, then you may speak in more principle-based theological things, or you may use that as the time to paint the picture with descriptive words, so that everyone has in their mind the picture of the battle scene, and you describe with some descriptive verbs and nouns the scene of the battle, right? And then with your description, then you zoom in and you say, and in the midst of all of this confusion, there is a woman, right? And then now you've focused in, right? And so you can use your words and your choice of words to really be the director of the show, right? The director in any television show determines the parameters of the camera angle, right? So there's other stuff going on, but they will zoom in so that all you can see in any given moment is what they want the focus to be on, right? So that's an important way to think about preparing these moves. The other thing to keep in mind, this goes along with what I was talking about with the ship, is the pace of change, right? How quickly you move from one thing to the next applies to the transitions, right? So we talked about the ship, and as the ship moves, but even the emphasis of your points, or your main theological statements or things, as you move from one move to the next, even if they're not necessarily major transitions, right? So say if you've got one kind of sub-point, but you've got 3 or 4 different illustrations. As you're moving from one thing to the next, keep in mind that same illustration. It doesn't matter if it's a major transition or a minor transition, your rate of change is affected by the number of people that you have, and so you want to be deliberate. When you think about actors, and when they're acting on either Broadway or a movie or something, what's actually going on is they exaggerate a lot of their emotions so that it seems normal on the camera, but to the person doing it, it's more of an exaggerated expression. It's more exaggerated in the way that it is, so that the people watching pick up on it more clearly. And so the same thing in a certain way applies to how you present your topics and your changes, right? So in your mind, you already know what the next thing is coming, and so if you're not careful, you will transition to the next point so quickly because it makes logical sense to you because you've been working on the sermon all week. But not everyone is prepared because they don't have the access to what you're about to speak. So they're only in that moment, and so you have to sometimes exaggerate, if you will, slow down, add a couple extra sentences to make it clear why you're transitioning from one scene to the next, right? And as you move from one thing to the next, it's okay if because at first it may feel like, man, I'm beating a dead horse here by saying 2 or 3 sentences about why we're moving into this next thing. But a lot of times that it only feels that way to the preacher because the preacher already knows what the next one is. But for somebody that doesn't know what the next thing that's coming is, those 2 or 3 sentences of preparation, of leading you into the next thing, are often vital for their comprehension. All right, let me give you just 1 or 2 other things, and then that'll be it for this week. There is no set amount of time, right, for each move. It could be 3 minutes, 5 minutes. Obviously, you don't want each move to be 10 or 12 minutes, probably, because then there's not much movement. But each one is going to be dependent on how you have it set up. It becomes much easier to think about it if you had, say, 5 moves that were going to be about 5 to 7 minutes each. That gives you 35 or 40 minutes, and then maybe an introduction and conclusion, and then you're up to about a 50-minute sermon. And then, so each of the 5 scenes, right? And then so in your practice, you can rehearse scenes individually. That really helps your preparation if you have it broken down into about 5 good scenes in your mind, because then you can rehearse them and you can then begin to think about each scene individually. What is the best way to say this? What is the best way to present it? Do I present it all up front, or do I hold some stuff back till the end so that there's kind of an aha moment? Or do I want to make this one plain so that everybody has time to really absorb it? Is there something that they may not have noticed before, and so I'll keep that hidden until a certain point, and then I bring that out, and then it seems like a revelation. Oh, wow, I didn't think about that, right? So if you just bring that out at the front, then it may not have the same impact. And so you're telling the story, and everybody's following along because it's something that they know, and then you bring out something that they may not have known, right? And so your timing about bringing out revelation, your timing about making points, the wording of how you tell your story, right, are all areas that are, I think, enhanced if you have it kind of broken down into a few individual scenes. And then just a couple other things. When you're thinking about putting this together, and you're thinking about your scenes and your thoughts and what you want to put in, sometimes it's helpful to answer the questions that your audience may have, or to put in opposing thoughts that are out there to show the victory of your way of thinking, right? You could say things like, a lot of times in the world, the thought process is this. And then you begin to show why God's way is better, right? And so it's not always just about showing and presenting truth, that sometimes when you contrast it with something that's not true, then it helps people to see the strength of God's position, right? Then let me give you just one other thing here, and then we'll close this one down. You want to have a strategy, right? A strategy for each scene. And I think that's an important way to think about it. That I have my strategy for the sermon is to break it into a few individual scenes that flow together towards this one main thought, right? But then within each individual scene, you should have a strategy that is going to maximize the impact for that scene, right? Sometimes the strategy is telling a story. Sometimes the strategy is bringing up an audience member as a visual aid. Sometimes the strategy is going to a different part of the Word of God and bringing in a story from a whole nother section that sheds light on the one that you're in, right? So if something took place in a particular city in the Old Testament, and then 1,000 years later in that same city, something else happens that is influential and that connects both stories together, then maybe as you're telling your story, one scene is to bring that in, right? And so there's a strategy for each scene. Sometimes a scene is giving application or a personal testimony. Perhaps the strategy for a scene is telling a story about someone in the church and how they did something well or whatever, and that's your strategy to bring it home, right? But so for each one, there should be a strategy. Sometimes it's telling a story up front and then having an impact in the back. Sometimes you've got a list of statistics, and that's your strategy for that particular point, that the way to do it is to give them this kind of plain list of statistics. And so that could be, for one, you don't want to do that through the whole sermon, but maybe that's the strategy for that one. And so you have a strategy. What is the focus? What are my description things? How do I describe this? What is the best way to present this? That you want to think in terms of individual moves, and for each individual move, you want to think in terms of strategy. How is the best way to present this unit, this move within the movement of my sermon, right? Okay, so that's some things to think about. Over the next week or two, we'll do a little more with structure as well, okay?